Warhammer 40K has a big problem, or a problem that's not big enough depending on who you ask, and that's just how big the massive god engines known as Titans actually are. Allow me to explain. You see, the artwork depicting Titans gives the impression that they are upwards of a mile tall, gargantuan monoliths of iron and steel, literal walking avatars of the machine god. But when you look a little bit deeper into their lore, you find that the measurements that Games Workshop gives us don't come anywhere close to matching the artwork. Add on to this a bunch of different sources from the last 30 years that all give different measurements, and you've got this perfect storm of conflicting information that has led to endless debates and arguments across the fandom about how big these things can actually get. And I'm not kidding, next to female space marines, how big an Emperor Titan actually is probably the most hotly debated subject in the entirety of the fandom. In this video, we're going to get to the bottom of exactly how big these things are, why there's so much conflicting information when it comes to concrete measurements with them, and why Games Workshop would seemingly be so wishy-washy when it comes to giving fans anything concrete to go off of. I spent the last week researching this video and looking into as many sources as I could that talk about how big the god engines can get, and some of the stuff that I found was actually kind of shocking. Since we're talking about really big Titans, we're mostly going to be focused on the Emperor class in this video, but I will touch on Scouts and Battle Titans as well. However, before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, a quick shout out to this video's sponsor. We're smack dab in the middle of winter, and when the cold weather hits, there's nothing better than cozying up at home with a mobile game that we can get absolutely stuck in. And my game of choice has been Raid Shadow Legends, the sponsor of this video. Not only is it available on both mobile and PC, but it has some amazing graphics, rewarding fast-paced gameplay, and over 800 incredible champions to collect and battle with. The big news this month is that Raid Shadow Legends is doing a massive crossover with the world of Monster Hunter, a franchise I am also a die-hard fan of. Insect Glaive main for life, baby. The event's gonna run from January 9th until March 5th, and not only is it going to have a ton of community events and other activities, but also 5 Monster Hunter themed legendary champions based off of classic Monster Hunter monsters. You can get the Rathalos Blademaster legendary champion for free simply by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and March 5th. And you can unlock the other 4 champions via special in-game events, so check in-game to see how to collect these amazing champions for yourself. If you haven't started playing Raid yet, what are you waiting for? Click on my link in the description or scan my QR code on screen to get some insane bonuses that are only available with my link, including 2 epic champions. You'll get Lightsworn, an epic champion from the Sacred Order right off the bat to help keep your team alive. And then, after reaching level 15, you'll unlock Epic Juliana, an attack-type champion that absolutely wrecks bosses. And once you're in game, whether you're a new or existing player, use my code RAIDXmas to get some sweet additional bonus rewards. Download Raid Shadow Legends today, and I'll see you in game. Big thanks to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Before we jump into the meat and potatoes of this video, I want to share with you a quick little personal story of my history with the Titans, because I'm pretty sure your story is similar to mine. Now, the first time I ever heard about these things, I thought they were just a myth. I didn't even think the Titans were real, because this was back in the early 2000s, and information about 40K's deeper lore wasn't readily available. But every now and then, me and my buddies would see a low-res image of an absolutely gigantic metal monstrosity towering over a Warhammer battlefield on the internet. The model itself was the size of a small child. I didn't know at the time that these were fan-made constructions and weren't official Games Workshop models, but it sparked that sense of wonder and imagination in me and my friends that I think 40K is particularly good at doing. Later on, when I started taking the lore a lot more seriously, I would look up all these different pictures of Titans, as some of them had their heads up in the clouds or were literally stepping over a mountain range as if it was nothing more than a speed bump to them. I and many other people assumed that based on the artwork, these things were multiple miles tall. And I just gotta tell you, to a 14-year-old, that is like the coolest thing ever. I remember being absolutely heartbroken when I went on a lore deep dive one night and I found out that the largest of them was supposedly only a pitiful 40 meters tall. To say that my inner child was crushed that day is a huge understatement. However, a few years down the road, I would start reading the Horus Heresy novels, and in the very first one, Horus Rising, a bunch of Titans are described as being around 140 meters tall. Or if we're going by freedom units for my fellow Americans, 469 feet. Now, that certainly is not a mile tall, but I'll give it to them, that's a big-ass war engine. I'm back on board. My inner child now has hope. Only for the follow-up book, False Gods, that was released 6 months later in the same year, one of those same titans was described as only being 40 meters tall again. What the actual hell was going on? And these size discrepancies were not unique to these two books. They happened a lot in a lot of different sources. Actual literal numbers in relation to a titan's size is kind of hard to find. For every single excerpt that has an actual height stated, there's another 20 or 30 scenes of a titan just being described as absolutely gargantuan, with a bunch of grimdark language and a tasteful amount of descriptive adjectives. But I was able to track down several sources for this video that did give us a specific figure. On page 94 of the Deathwatch RPG book, The Achilles Assault, there's a scene that describes an abandoned Imperator Titan that is discovered by a team of scavengers on a remote world, and it was stated as being at least 50 meters tall. Then there's the Fire Warrior novel, where an Emperor-class Titan was described as being at least 60 stories, which is almost 200 meters. Then in the novel Deliverance Lost, there is a Titan that Alfarius believes is at least 90 meters tall. And finally, on the most ridiculous end of the spectrum, we have a quote from the audio drama Blood in the Machine that describes the weapons mounted on a Titan's shoulders being a kilometer in length. And judging by most of the artwork, an Imperator Titan's guns are about a third of the length of their overall height, and that would make this one in particular almost 10,000 feet tall. Bear in mind, these are just a few examples I was able to find with some strategic Google searching and control searching through a bunch of different Warhammer PDFs. I've read a lot of Warhammer novels, but I haven't read all of them, and I'm sure there are a lot of other examples of truly massive titans out there. So if you know of any, let me know in the comment section down below. Needless to say, all of this was not adding up. So in order to get to the bottom of their size discrepancies, I decided to go back to the original source on Titans, the 1988 rulebook for the first edition of Adeptus Titanicus, and I wanted to compare it to its more modern version, which released in 2018. There was a common misconception that, I'm going to be honest, I personally believed myself, that said that the early lore of the Titans had them being much larger, and over time they got scaled down to bring them in line with the rest of the setting, and try to add at least a small degree of realism to them. But to my absolute astonishment, this didn't turn out to be true. In fact, if anything, they've gotten larger over time. These are the figures given in the 1988 book in comparison to the ones given in 2018. Now, unfortunately, the original book doesn't give us the size of a Scout Titan, and the new one doesn't give us the stated height of an Emperor class. So when it comes to the Emperors, I'm going to use the stated figure from the Deathwatch RPG book of 50 meters tall. And just comparing these figures, the Warlord Titans of today are larger than the Emperor class Titans from the late 80s. So with all that said, we're going to go with the figures that the Emperor class is 50 meters tall, the Warlord about 33, the Reavers at 25, and the Scouts at 17. So with those ballpark figures in mind, let's take a look at some quintessential Titan artwork. Now, I love this image in particular, as it gives us a really good comparison of a Warlord standing next to an Emperor class. And when you take the measurements we've already established, a Warlord standing at 33 meters and the Emperor at 50, these measurements seem to be pretty accurate in this piece of art, if you're specifically measuring up to the top of the Titans' heads. What these figures fail to take into account is the cathedral on the Emperor's back. Because if you do take that into consideration, then the Emperor class is more than twice as tall as a Warlord when measuring to its highest peak. So we could estimate it at realistically being between 66 and 70 meters tall. In my opinion, I believe that under normal circumstances, when Games Workshop is telling us the height of an Emperor-class Titan, they don't count the fortress on top of it. 70 meters is still a far cry from the 140-meter behemoths from Horus Rising, or from the one book with the kilometer-long weapons, but to my giant war engine-loving self, it's at least a little bit better. I think it goes without saying that the official artwork that Games Workshop has released over the last 30 years that depicts Titans isn't always 100% accurate. But most of the time, unless this artwork is a literal diagram, it's not meant to be. It's meant to convey the emotion and power of a scene. It's meant to get the idea of the Titan across to the viewer, as well as filling you with the same sense of awe that the individuals in the picture must be feeling when they look up into the face of a god machine. And in that aspect, I think the artwork is truly amazing and captures that feeling perfectly. Now, even though the artwork isn't always super accurate, it's a lot more accurate than a pretty big chunk of the community seems to think. Speaking of which, I saw this meme circulating around in the last couple of weeks that was originally posted on Grimdank, and the OP was pointing out the ridiculousness of a Titan's weapons being stated at only being 130 feet long. but the picture makes them seem absolutely gargantuan. So I threw on my detective hat, opened up Photoshop, and did a little bit of sleuthing into this particular image. The plasma annihilator here on the Titan is the closest part of it towards the people on the balcony, so we're going to use that as our starting point. Then we're going to grab the figure directly underneath it and assume that this guy is between 5.5 and 6 feet tall. Then if we do a little bit of copying and pasting, we see that the barrel of the gun is about 6 dudes tall, which equates to about 33 to 36 feet. Then if we duplicate them, drag them over to the end of the Titan's Hellstorm cannon, and shrink down our dudes to match, it sans a little bit of height since the barrel is slightly smaller at the end, then rotate and duplicate them along the barrel, we see that the weapon is 22 dudes long, which equates to 121 to 132 feet. I'll admit the Hellstorm cannon does have a slight tilt to it, so you could probably squeeze a few more guys in towards the back as the gun tilts into the background, but for the most part, it's a pretty straight side profile without a lot of variance from end to end. And I'll admit, this is not the most accurate way of measuring something like this, but it gives you an idea that the measurements that Games Workshop gives us are more accurate than people think. We struggle to envision what something that big would actually look like. Like, for example, in the first measurement, the barrel of that gun is 33 to 36 feet tall, which is just roughly over 3 stories. Can you even imagine staring down the barrel of a gun that's 3 stories tall? That is ridiculous. And side note, I will admit that even though I believe the artwork that Games Workshop has come out with in the last several years is more accurate than people give them credit for, that goes right out the window for some of the older artwork. Like this picture that served as the cover for the second Titan graphic novel. I don't even know how you're supposed to measure something like this. That thing is absolutely enormous. It's a common joke within the Warhammer community that Games Workshop is absolutely terrible with numbers, whether it be just how many guardsmen make up a regiment, how many people could conceivably live on any given planet, or how tall a Titan is. Now, I'm a person that will definitely die on the hill that Warhammer 40K has a clearly defined canon. I will admit that over the last 30 years, a bunch of little inconsistencies have started to pile up. Not enough to break the canon, mind you, but enough for me and other nerds like myself to argue back and forth endlessly. But even if Games Workshop is terrible with numbers, side note they definitely are, why not just let the Titans be absolutely enormous? I think the vast majority of us can agree that Titans the size of skyscrapers would be objectively cooler. And to the people that would disagree with that fact, why do you hate fun? Let me know all about your fun, hate, and beliefs down in the comment section below. Anyways, there's a couple of reasons I can think of for the reduced scale. The most obvious one is that Warhammer 40,000 at its core is a tabletop wargame. That's what it was at its first inception, and even though the IP has expanded over the years to where it's now a multimedia juggernaut, at its beating heart, the tabletop game still influences the entirety of the setting. And within the tabletop game, everything is to scale. The traditional Warhammer 40K tabletop uses 32mm heroic scale, whereas games like Epic use 6mm and Titanicus uses 8mm. Although Games Workshop has never released an official Emperor-class Titan for Warhammer 40K, they did make one for Epic all the way back in the early 90s. By today's standards, this model does look kind of derpy, but I'm just gonna be honest, I think it's cool as hell. However, there's a good reason for them not releasing one for 40K, as in 32mm scale, an Emperor-class Titan would be absolutely gigantic. Bear in mind that the model that we did get for Epic was using this slightly smaller height of around 32 meters, whereas today's Emperor-class Titans are stated at being 50 without the cathedral, and we're pushing into 60, 70, or 80 meters tall with it. The model would be unusable for gaming purposes. It would basically just be an oversized piece of terrain that completely dominated the board, and realistically, they probably wouldn't sell that many of them, because a Warlord Titan goes for around $3,000 US, and this thing would easily be upwards of $8,000 to $10,000. Only available to the wealthiest of collectors. From their perspective, what would the point be in spending all of the time designing such an intricate model if they're only going to sell about 20 of them? Now, all that being said, if the Titans aren't 150 meters or taller, it is theoretically possible that we could get a model for one, especially when it comes to smaller scale games like Titanicus or Legion Imperialis. If these games continue to sell well, then I have a feeling we will eventually see an updated Emperor-class Titan model. But I wouldn't hold your breath for one in 40K or Horus Heresy. Can you just imagine if they were to come out and say that, yep, all Emperor-class Titans are 150 meters tall, and we're gonna make a model for it? The thing would be like 7 feet tall. It's already a big enough pain in the ass getting your army from the house to the store, let alone having to pack it up to travel to a tournament. You got me fucked fucked up if you think I'm breaking down and transporting a 7-foot tall, thick-ass Titan boy and transporting that big bastard to the store. It's never gonna happen. So yeah, in conclusion, if Games Workshop can't sell a model for it, and they can't find a way to fit it into their pre-existing game types, then it's probably not going to be in the lore, hence the smaller Titan scale. So now that we know the gameplay and financial reasons why Games Workshop might want to go with a slightly smaller scale for the Emperor-class Titans, what about the lore implications? Money be damned, it was just something that was supposed to exist in the lore and be really cool. This is currently how things are, but in that context, then why not let them be 300 meters tall, 500 meters tall? F it, no, why not let them be 10 miles tall? What's holding them back? Now, controversial hot take here, but Warhammer 40,000 is one of those franchises that tends to value the rule of cool over scientific accuracy. Now, that's not to discredit them, as they put a pretty good amount of effort into maintaining a degree of realism for most of the characters, factions, weaponry, and war gear that can be found in its lore. It's no Star Trek by any means in terms of accuracy, and it definitely relies on space magic like Star Wars does, but part of its grimy grittiness is in its realism. And although Titans are theoretically possible in the real world, they would have so many problems that they would have to compensate for that their construction is pretty impractical. I think Games Workshop has realized this and thus put some limitations on just how ridiculous they can be. Honestly, if you were really going to build a Titan, you could use that same amount of resources and manpower to construct an entire fleet of tanks, which would serve you much better in the long run. But let's examine this a little bit further and compare a Titan to a good old-fashioned tank. Now, whereas a tank distributes its weight over a larger area via its tracks, it creates a lot less ground pressure and thus doesn't sink into the earth. A Titan, on the other hand, has all of that weight bearing down on just 2 feet, let alone the fact that every single time it takes a step, all of that weight is concentrated on a single foot, making it far more likely to sink into the earth with every step that it takes. And since it's a bipedal war machine that is considerably top-heavy, its likelihood of tipping over and coming down in a titanic avalanche of iron and steel on top of its own allies would be a pretty likely scenario. I would go as far as to say that a Titan being designed to look vaguely like a human is potentially its biggest flaw. You see, human beings are something of a rarity in the animal kingdom in that we walk upright on 2 legs, and we can do this without constantly tripping over ourselves. If somebody knocks us over, our body immediately reacts to try to stop us from falling. Our legs kick out to stabilize us. Now, fun fact, the Emperor-class Titans are not known for having particularly swift reflexes. They're so gigantic and heavy that it's just not going to be able to do this. It's not going to be able to react quickly enough to stabilize itself. Perhaps even more of a glaring weakness is the huge joints in a Titan's leg. These are going to be incredibly vulnerable targets that will need a considerable amount of heavy armor to protect them. But the more armor you put on here, the less maneuverable they become, and it's going to get to the point where they eventually can't move at all, which defeats the entire purpose of being on 2 legs and being able to walk around in the first place. The larger the Titan is, the bigger these weak points, and all it takes is a couple of well-placed shots and your massive god engine is going to come toppling to the ground. There was actually a great scene in the Night Lord trilogy where all it took to take down a Titan was like 7 Night Lords and a handful of Melta charges. Now, this certainly was one of those scenes from a novel that's more bolter-prone and not meant to be accurate. It was just supposed to be super epic, as in the Warhammer universe this normally would never happen, but it's a pretty good example of how impractical Titans are and how vulnerable they can be. So we've established that Titans don't really make a lot of sense, but that doesn't matter. They're cool as fuck and one of the greatest things in the entire setting. The only problem is that your suspension of disbelief can only go so far, and the bigger a Titan gets, the more glaringly obvious its problems become. For me personally, at 40 to 60 meters, I can completely suspend my disbelief and just enjoy the novel for what it is. But any bigger than that, and I'm gonna start asking some questions. I'm no science fiction guru, and I don't know much about mathematics or engineering. There's other YouTubers on this platform that have gone into far more detail than I can on the complications of mechs and giant robots in the real world. So I've linked a couple of those videos in the description down below that helped me better understand this particular set of issues. And it's where I got most of the information for this section from. So credit to them for teaching me something that I didn't actually know. But what do you think of all this? Do you wish the Titans really were 10-mile-tall walking gods, or do you like them just the way they are? If you were going to change anything about them and their lore, what would it be? What's your favorite war machine in Warhammer 40K? Are you particularly drawn to the Titans, or are you more of a tank and/or demon engine kind of guy? Let me know all of your thoughts, ideas, and questions down in the comment section below. And don't forget to check out Raid Shadow Legends using my link in the description to get some cool free rewards. I also just realized that I haven't asked my community to subscribe to my channel in like a year or so, which I think is something that you're supposed to do as a YouTuber. So hi, if you've been watching my videos for a while and you haven't subscribed yet, come on, go ahead and click on that button. I promise you're gonna feel a whole lot better after you do. Big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.